collective, cooperative economics. That's what you should be focusing on. Now let's look at that. Collective, cooperative. What does that mean? That means coming together as a people, playing as a group. Why? Because see, racism is a group sport. It's a team sport. Either you play as a team or you lose by default. That's your problem. You're not playing as a team. You have never played as a team. That's your problem. You cannot talk about coming to this ceremony and start talking about collective and cooperative economics without understanding at one point you're playing games with yourself. And so I'm gonna tell you, that's the first problem. The second problem is understanding what economics is. Economics is a Greek word. It comes from the word which Greek meaning getting one's domestic house in order. So if you're going to start talking about collective, coming together as a group, or collectively, cooperative, doing what? Getting one's house in order. You have not done that. No blacks in this country has done that. You have not been, you've been playing not to win, but play to lose. And so that's the first point. Now, why haven't we come together and done these things that were recommended and incorporated into Ujima for Kwanzaa? Here's the first thing, is that throughout history, you must have a driving element to bring people together. You must have some force to pull you together. All around this world, one of the first things people used throughout history was religion. Religion was a driving force to bring people together and unite them. Everybody on earth has done that, except certain people. Let's go back and start with, back in history, when the Arabs were the first ones to enslave black folk in the world. They were the first enslavers. They're still enslaving you all around the world. Right now in Sudan, Ethiopia, Mauritania, they're still selling black for $150 each. But they had one thing going for them. They knew how to protect collectivism and cooperation. They came in as a group. So about 765 AD, they started using their religion to begin to pull themselves together and practicing economics. And so they marched into Africa in 756 AD, and saying, we're going into Africa in the search of the 3 G's, God, glory, and gold. That was way back. They understood that. And they used it. They started exporting blacks out of Africa. And in the course of the last 1,300 years, they've shipped out over 13 million black folk around the world in slavery. They made money off of it. But they stayed together, and they knew how to get money and make it. They used the religion to drive the economics for their people. Then following them, up comes the Catholics. You see, we got that. See, here you come up now in the 1400s, something else happened. They began to use religion. See, Henry the Navigator went off the coast of Africa, picked up about 16 blacks, Africans, and took them back to Italy and gave them to the Pope in the Vatican and says, here's some people that right now, they're not together, they're disorganized. I got 16 of them, I picked up, you can have them, and gave them to him. And the Pope, they used those blacks from about 1445 all the way up to about 1488. They used them for what? For servants, slaves. And by 1488, something happened. And it came out through Pope Innocent. Pope Innocent, the Catholic Pope, said, hey, this is a good thing. He said, now up to this, prior to this time, throughout history, contrary to what you all hear today from the Hannity and the Fox channel, that everybody's been enslaved. So consequently, there's no use in being sensitive about black folk preaching about slavery, because blacks are they're not no exception. People have been enslaving people since the Garden of Eden. That's a lie. Up to 1488, when Pope Innocent raised this issue, you could only be a slave any place by 3 things. 1, for personal indebtedness. 2, by being through religious persecution. Or 4, by being a prisoner of war. That was the only 3 reasons they were enslaving people in the world. But Pope Innocent put out a public edict in 1488, said this is such a good thing for using these people. Let's put in another factor. Let's use these people anytime. Don't enslave anybody else. No Indians, no Arabs, nobody else. Enslave these people. And that was in 1488. And that's what that started slavery. And that made black folk very special, different people from anybody else on earth. And when Columbus discovered America, about 5 years later, and he found this land over here, quotes, discovered, and went back to Europe. Europe was a decimated, crime-ridden, infested city. A continent was going down the toilet, could not make it, criminalized. And all of a sudden, they were trying their best to figure out how do we resuscitate the entire European continent with nothing. Our people are starved to death. And when Columbus came back and said, I found an answer. I found land across the ocean. And we call it the Americas, North America, Central America, South America. The land is not very well inhabited. We can go over there and use that land. And all of a sudden, when they said that, they said, in fact, going back to what Pope Innocent said, we got a labor we can use. And from that moment on...
Hello, brothers and sisters. Welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you are doing great from wherever you're watching me from. Dr. Cloud Anderson is a Black American professor, especially he have talked about much of the Black economy. One of his most known works is Powernomics, right? And this is a book that tries to advocate for Black excellence. It talks to unite Black people economically, like just unifying socially, unifying politically is not enough. Black people need to be unified economically, because other forms of group don't have the right intention towards Black people. And he narrates this starting from the history of slavery, and he brings it back to why he thinks and he believes that Black people need to unify economically. Black people need to organize themselves because other groups are moving so fast, brothers and sisters. One thing that I'd like to say up front about Dr. Cloud Anderson is that type of person who is really harsh about Black people. You know, we have different teachers with different teaching methods, but for Dr. Cloud Anderson, for the most time that I've known him or interacted with his words, is a person that always thinks that the worst is coming. And so he needs to prepare the Black community to embrace themselves for what is really coming. Now, Dr. Cloud Anderson's central argument is that the Black people worldwide must move with urgency because history is shifting. Global power blocks are consolidating, and the window of Black economic independence is rapidly closing. Remember that his warnings comes from a clear reading of world trends. Nations are forming tight economic alliances, ethnic groups are concentrating resources, and wealth is becoming more centralized. Dr. Cloud Anderson believes that Black communities have little time left to build the economic foundation needed for protection, stability, and influence in an increasingly competitive global economy. In his framework, progress does not come from moral appeals or political symbolism, but from ownership, but from group solidarity and strategic economic action. Brothers and sisters, please watch the video. I'll be back and then I'll be sharing my thoughts in regards to this. So let's keep watching. I'll be back.
Something happened is very important. We started talking about collective economics. At that point in time, they said that they came up with a new concept. Prior to that time, that mercantilism was the factor for economics. Everything was mercantilism. But at that point in time, they said, we got a new thing. If we could be able to get land, free land, and get this Black labor, this free Black labor, and we merge those two together, we got a good thing. And they did that. They came up with a concept called capitalism. Capitalism meaning, now you remember this is very important if you're going to start talking about collective and cooperative economics. Don't forget this, what capitalism is. Don't let anybody badmouth capitalism. You say, well, capitalism is not bad. The only reason we've never been able to use it. That's your problem. Don't badmouth something that you never used. And so capitalism, they say capitalism would be learning how to own the land, the tools, and the resources, and use other people's labor to enhance you and enrich you. That is capitalism. I'm gonna say it to you again. You got to get control of the land, the tools, and the resources, and use other people's labor to enhance yourself with wealth and power and resources. Thank you, baby. Just like being up at Northwestern again. And so, and that's the basis of capitalism. And that started in Europe about 1503 and 1505. And that once they got that set up, another thing about 10 or 15 years later, another concept popped up called politics. And you have to understand this. Politics has no power. Don't mess around with politics unless you understand what you're dealing with. Politics is simply a process that came into existence in the 15th century that says what? It says that based on a simple premise of quid pro quo. It's a process that decides who's going to get what benefits out of life. So they started politics as we know it today. That started about 1515 or 1520 in that general time frame. Politics' primary responsibility is to protect those people who got the money. is to take care of that. What controls politics is economics. The biggest force you got in this country, the most powerful force in the country is economic power. Politics would do anything that economics wanted to do. That's why this country right now, you got about 658 white multi-billionaires in this country. That's who controls this country. No politics. They tell the politicians what to do. That's what Donald Trump's been trying to tell you all. And they're going to tell you, well, we got to go out and vote. Vote ain't worth a quarter. Voting doesn't change anything. People who own and control the system controls the votes. But I'm going to get to that a little later. So when they came to America, now they got a new concept. That new concept is going to be called racism. Because when they matched those two together, and that brought all whites began to merge then. They began to play economics in Europe. They came together to practice it. And so what happened? 9 European nations started coming to America, and to the Latin America, South America, Central America, looking for what? Free land. And they came over, that became the first thing, that was the first indication of what's going to be called racism. Racism is a competitive relationship between groups. Remember this. Racism is a competitive relationship between groups. It has nothing in the world to do with an individual. Quit letting people call you a racist. Racism doesn't exist with an individual. It's based on a group phenomenon. It's a group factor. And to be a racist, you must be a part of, associated with, identified with those who got the wealth and power. That's racism. It's a competitive relationship between groups of people who are competing for the ownership and control of wealth, resources, and power. And once they get it, they then use it against another weaker group. That's why I hear people say, well, Farrakhan's a racist. Farrakhan ain't no way on earth Farrakhan can never be a racist. Farrakhan can't tell white folk what the hell to do. He can't do anything. He can't control no white folk, tell them where they can live, who they can marry, when they're going to school. You got to have power and wealth. You got to have the economic wealth and power to be a racist. And I'm sick and tired of black folk. I would let somebody tell you black folk, if y'all start looking out for y'all will be a racist. Forget that crap. You cannot, no place on earth black folk can be a racist. So they came to America with the new concept called racism. And now the game is going to play in. But see, whites had organized, all those European nations, 9 European nations organized to come to this country. Portugal, France, Italy, French, German, Russians, Norway. They all came here, Spain, to what? To look for wealth and power. When they came here, then the game started. But they were organized, they were collective, and they were cooperating. They were together. And they brought certain people here to make sure that you were not together. And they brought you from different tribes and split you up. Make sure that those who spoke the same language could even associate together. And they disaggregated you. Now we're in the United States. Now we're at the beginning of this. Let's go up to the 1700s. When they got here, all of a sudden they said, we're going to build a democracy. We're going to build a new nation. We're going to build a land of opportunity. And so I said, what we're going to do, let's write a constitution. So they wrote the Constitution and ratified it in 1789. And in that Constitution, it said what you are today. And I'm sick and tired again. You're going to get sick of hearing me saying I'm sick. But I'm sick and tired of black folk getting in political office, running for office, and getting into a legislature, getting into a law firm, and don't even understand the Constitution. Talking about, well, we got constitutional rights. You don't have any constitutional rights. No place in the Constitution does it give black folk any rights. And when the planning committee for the writing and drafting the Constitution met in Philadelphia, they spent an entire week talking that most of the subject was on what they're going to do with black folk in America. They said, we're going to write a constitutional document. And in that document that we write, we got to make sure that everything is perfectly clear on who's going to get what in the country. So when they met, they spent a whole week with the doors locked, guards on the doors, and the shutters drawn, and sat there and debated. How do we in the world draft a constitution of the United States, and when at the same time talking about the land of democracy, the cradle of democracy, the land of opportunity, free from all? How do we say that God has given every human being inalienable rights for life, liberty, and the pursuit of what? No, it's wrong. It was property. They changed it later. That's why they came with the fugitive slave laws in 1850 and again in 1890 and 1850. It was property. And so Thomas Jefferson said, what do we do then? They said, they asked Thomas Jefferson to write the document, but make sure these black folk don't understand what's going on. So they wrote that document. What that document says is when it says, we the people, we the citizens, they were not talking about black folk. We have to talk about the American people. Right now, you go to Fox Channel, they always talk about the American people did this. They are not talking about you. They said, what we would do, they said, here's what we'll do. Every time we're talking about white folk, we'll use very specific language. The American people, citizens, stuff like that, and the general population. That means white folk. When you got the black folk in the Constitution, and I keep saying how these people go to law school and get law degrees and understand this. They use morphic terms, ambiguous terms, euphemism to define you all. They call you and they look at the Constitution and read all those documents when it says those people, those others, those indebted, those in bondage, that specific property, that unhappy lot. They're talking about you. They're not talking, so there's no place in the Constitution that says anything about black folk. They call you 3/5 of a human being. They call you property. They call you equal to a field animal. How in the world you think they're talking about, well, the Constitution never promised you anything. So please don't go to any more of these demonstrations that I can hear on TV talking about the Constitution promised you nothing. And all they did was organize all the whites. And the Constitution became an affirmative action plan. The first affirmative action plan in the nation was written by Thomas Jefferson and that group, planning group, which called the colonial powers of the founding fathers. That was an affirmative action plan for whites. And here's the other point you have to remember before I get to the end of my little speech tonight. It became the first affirmative action plan, but it also put whites into a protected class. Critically, you're in a protected class with the affirmative action and the Constitution. And then they set up the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of this United States is the guardian of the status quo that was laid out for you all in the Constitution. Makes your whites up here and you're down here. The Supreme Court is the most racist organization on earth. They're the guardian of racism. That's why the first 57 people appointed to the United States Supreme Court were slave owners. And out of another 60-something that's been appointed since then, they're white racists. They never put a black man of any substance on the Supreme Court. They put one guy who was very strong and he was strong enough, the first black president. Personal assembly code. I loved him. He tried the best he could, but he's playing against the odds. The guy you got on there now, I don't even call that a black man. I don't even know what that is. Y'all got a name? What is that? What's his name? Clarence who? Yeah. So we've only had one black man on the Supreme Court out of over 120. The last thing you should do is be going to the Supreme Court and looking for justice in the court system. You can't get it. It's not there. They're going to reinforce what's in the Constitution. And surprisingly, they don't even have the authority to do that. The United States Supreme Court does not have the authority to do anything with black folk. All these issues you all been taking to the courts about civil rights, discrimination, racism, and going to the court system, the courts can't help you. They're not going to help you. That's why the Supreme Court has never done not one single solid thing, positive for black folk. If I does something incidentally to help black folk here and there, that is not their intent. They had no intention of doing anything for you. Their primary responsibility is to maintain the status quo. And the little bit of authority exercising now over you didn't even come into existence until about 1803 in the Marlborough and Madison decision. When all of a sudden, in the Madison and Marlborough decision, they jumped in and started exercising authority they didn't have and got involved in a case. That was the first time they ever left because what they were assigned to do in the Constitution. The Supreme Court has three things they can do. One, they can get involved in ambassadorial appointments. Two, they can go and get involved in lower case litigation. And three, they can hold court on anybody who fails to carry out his federal responsibilities. That's the only thing. But they do not have authority to overrule Congress. Now, why is this important? Here's what we're coming to. We're talking about getting you all together, playing cooperative economics and collective economics. The only time it was challenged was by a guy named Dred Scott in 1857. In 1857, Dred Scott says, I'm free. I should be able to go back to my own people and live free with them without all this abuse and misuse of me. He said, something is wrong. And Dred Scott was the first one to make that in the Supreme Court. But let me put a period and go back to 1790, back to the Constitution, because this is very important. Now, in 1789, when they ratified the United States Constitution, with black folk being nothing of any consequence, you have no value except how you're being used. So when that was in 1789, the next year, the first next year, after they ratified the Constitution, what they did, they passed what's called the First Nationalization and Immigration Law. And in that law, they declared that this would be a white nation, and that only people have access to benefits and be in a protected class have to either be white or can pass for white. And that's why at the present day, the federal government keeps federalizing all these immigrants coming to the country, classifying them as whites. Because that was the issue in 1790, the First Naturalization and Immigration Law. And they said, once they set that up, they said, therefore, that would be what you all call today the American dream. Now, what was the American dream at that point? Everybody coming, it was a nation for immigrants. That anybody could come to this nation as an immigrant and get access and be put into a special protected class. And as they began to pour into the country under the 1790 Immigration and Nationalization Law, they said, now what we're going to do is that we're going to redistribute this wealth. And most of the wealth will be contained in one thing starting off as a basis, and that would be land. That's the first thing, would be land. And so what George Washington says, well then, in that regard, I want 100,000 acres of free land. And so George Washington that you all talk about in your textbooks, they never tell you that he got 100,000 acres of free land. And when he did that, then Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Constitution, said, wait a minute, if we're going to start practicing economics, we're going to practice economics, I want 100,000 acres of free land. So Thomas Jefferson got 100,000 acres of free land, just like George Washington did. And then following that, you had Patrick Henry, that you all read about the textbook talking about, give me liberty or give me death. He said, well, you gave them 100,000, give me 65,000 land, along with that death. And so he got 65,000 acres of free land. And then they set up these immigration laws that anybody coming to America at that point in time, they're coming from Europe, to get wealth and power and to practice economics based on the Constitution, they were qualified to come together as whites and get collectively to do practice group economics. And so each one of them coming to America was entitled to 640 acres of free land. Every white that came to America that got a slave, he can get another 150 acres of free land for every slave he owned. They gave the railroads. You had about something like 11 railroads. 11 railroads picked up over 24 million acres of land. And the railroads got 6 miles of free land on either side of the railroads stretching across this country. Free land on both sides of the railroad tracks, all the way across the nation, any way you went. And they picked up over 24 million acres of free land. And the last immigrants that came to America in about 1880s, when they crossed the Mississippi River, and they wanted to get land there. And what they picked up in 24 hours, they picked up 2 million acres of free land. So what I'm saying to you, in all this land distribution, using the 1890 civil immigration laws, the naturalization laws, and the Constitution together, they put white folks into a protected class, affirmative action class, so they could only control the wealth. Whites picked up over 1 billion, B-I, they picked up over 1 billion acres of free land. And in that free land is where the wealth was buried. They got in that free land gold, silver, chrome, bauxite, magnesium, oil, gas, timber, everything they needed. That's how you got a maldistribution of wealth in this country, that you're playing against a stacked deck. They got all that wealth and money. Now all that wealth they picked up in that land alone, it has now accumulated. Because you see, the purpose of slavery, I have yet in all my years with presidents and governors going around the world, when I was going into Colombia, Venezuela, Bermuda, Jamaica, France, England, Germany, and Africa, representing the United States, I try to tell my people this: you're playing against a stacked deck if you don't get the money and the wealth. Because see, and the first thing you got to do that, you must go back and ask every politician, every civil rights leader, and every lawyer to go challenge what happened to black folk in the Constitution. Because the purpose of and question the purpose of slavery. They never asked what was the purpose of slavery. Purpose of slavery was not somebody cheated you out of integration and civil rights. The purpose of slavery was to systematically, socially engineer black folk into the lowest levels of a real life monopoly game and to maldistribute almost 100% of all this nation's wealth, land, income, businesses, rights, privileges, controls of all levels of government, and resources into the hands of the dominant white society. Now, you want me to repeat that to you again? Again, the whole purpose of slavery, which has never been challenged. Nobody goes back and challenges the purpose of slavery and raise that as a major issue. The major issue with slavery is to set up that special class, a protected class, and to maldistribute almost 100% of all this nation's land, business, wealth, power, income, privileges, rights, and controls of all levels of government into the hands of the dominant white society. So consequently, when that ended, what happened? That black folk, by the time you get by the end of the Civil War, black folk only had one half of one. That's all the wealth they had in the 1860s on the eve of the Civil War. You're playing against a stack, and at that time, when the Civil War ended, the average white person had 3,500 more time than the average black person. Now, I'll go back to Dred Scott. When Dred Scott then, in 1857, went to court, what Dred Scott was saying, he says, I need to be able to get out here, get with my own people, and build some things, and acquire some wealth and power so we can practice some group economics. Right. And so the Taney court says, Supreme Court says, no, you can't do that. Because, see, the Constitution has you defined. And see, you are classified as property. Dred Scott you cannot own property because you are property. And so black folk couldn't get any property. And they go around asking property. You can't get property, can't own property. Well, I can get it as you're not citizens. You didn't become a citizen until after the Civil War. Blacks don't know that. You couldn't own and control anything. Property can't own property, and you weren't even a citizen until after the Civil War. And so the court said to Taney, a black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. And so now when the Civil War comes on, and at the end of the Civil War, as I said, before that, blacks had nothing. By the end of the Civil War, you had a few radical Republicans. The radical Republicans were white men in the Congress who either had black mistresses or black children. And that's why they set up Howard University for them. See, Howard University set up strictly for the children of white congressmen and so anyway, so they came to the floor. That was Thaddeus Stevens, Sumter, and Benjamin, a few radical Republicans. They says that in this country now, that the Civil War has ended, for black folk to come together and start practicing anything on a group basis and practice economics, they can't do it. It's impossible unless they minimally have 40 acres, a mule, and $100. And they wrote that up as the first civil rights law in the country in 1865.
Hello brothers and sisters, welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you're great. Now, a major part of Anderson's message is that the other groups are not waiting. Asians have strengthened their global trade networks. Europeans continue to cooperate economically despite internal disagreements. Middle East nations are consolidating wealth through sovereign funds, and the Latino population across the Americas are building political and cultural unity. These groups pool resources along lines of identity and shared interest. Meanwhile, black communities around the world remain the least unified, the least economically protected, and the most dependent on the economic structures of other groups. Anderson warns that this imbalance leaves black people vulnerable in the world where wealth determines gain, power, security, and survival. Also, according to Anderson, black people cannot compete if they are not economically organized. And he argues that black communities often rely on individual success. One doctor, one lawyer, one celebrity, while other groups rely on collective success. This individualistic approach makes it easier for other groups to dominate markets, control industries, and set the terms of economic exchange. Anderson stresses that economic unification must begin with building institutions that include banks, schools, distribution system, media outlets, land ownership, and business networks. Without these structures, black people have no economic base from which to mobilize political power or negotiate within the global economy. He also emphasizes that time is working against black communities, especially in the United States. Demographic changes means that black people are becoming a smaller percentage of the population, while other minority groups are growing larger and more economically influential. The racial wealth gap continues to widen. Automation is eliminating traditional jobs, and immigration shifts economic priorities towards other groups. Anderson argues that unless black people build collective wealth now, they will become a permanent underclass locked out of resources, control, political influence, and meaningful economic participation. Another key aspect of Anderson's warning is the rise of ethnic competition, because he believes that other groups see black people as not partners but as economic rivals to be outmaneuvered. This is not an emotional argument but a structural one. Remember that groups prioritize their own fend, their own uplift, their own. Anderson argues that black communities must adopt this same mindset, not to compete destructively, but to protect themselves in a world that rewards group loyalty. Without a unified economic base, black people remain dependent on employees who do not have their interests at heart, on a political system that historically ignored them, and on markets they do not control. Also, Dr. Cloud Anderson connects economics to culture and identity. He argues that without economic power, black communities cannot control their narratives or defend themselves from ideological attacks. Media ownership determines how black history is told, how black struggles are portrayed, and how identity is shaped. When other groups control these systems, they also control the perception of black people globally. Economic independence, therefore, is not only about money, it is about self-determination, dignity, and freedom from psychological dependency. Anderson believes economic unification is the tool that allows black people to rebuild their culture, restore their pride, and reinforce a collective worldview. In conclusion, Dr. Cloud Anderson's warning is a call for acceleration, to move faster, to build faster, unite faster, and think collectively. He argues that the world is entering a period of intense economic competition, where groups without consolidated economic base will suffer the most. Black people across the world, whether in Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, or the Americas, must see themselves as one global family with shared interests. Unity is no longer optional. It is survival strategy. Anderson's message is clear. If black people do not unify now, they will be outpaced and overshadowed by groups that understand the power of coordinated economic action. But if they act collectively, they can transform their conditions and command global respect. Please let me know what you think and feel about this. I'm your host and presenter, Agent Stories. But until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salute.